where they're placed at, and it's always the function name opened up by parentheses, and then depending on how many parameters they accept, you just separate those by comma. So this would be suitable for a background color where you're using red, green, blue values along with an alpha value, which means you can make it transparent. You could also do math for properties. So if you're trying to make the margin, which is dealing with white space on a UI design, you can use the calc function, and you can do division, multiplication, all the four primary math functions that you can add in there. CSS also has animations, which we're going to implement in a very simple manner with our document, and they allow you to animate these HTML elements through both the animation property and the transition property. So the animation property, along with keyframes, allows you to create more complex animations. So if you define an animation that's 10 seconds long, you can use keyframes and control the values of different properties in terms of the percentage between that occurs for that 10-second duration. It's a little hard to explain without showing you, so I will show you an example of this when we get to the project. And then the transition property is more simplistic. It simply allows you to transition between two different CSS values. CSS media queries, this is a very important one, and we're going to get into because we're going to make our design responsive. So media queries allow you to define different rule sets for different screen sizes, and this is referred to as responsive design, responsive CSS, responsive web design, RWD as it's called. And it allows a page to adapt accordingly to varying screen sizes. And this is an example of what a media query looks like. So you define it up here, and you use something like min width or max width, and you give it a value of maybe something like 650 pixels, and then you put in your rule sets here where you can either add, remove, or define new rule sets or overwrite rule sets that were written outside of here to change them based on the width of the screen. So just as a side note, back when I started learning CSS and web development in general in like late 90s, early 2000s, we didn't have responsive design because we didn't need it. When people used web pages, they only used it through the context of a monitor, these big bulky computer monitors, the CRTs as they're called, or their laptop. And so the screen sizes were all pretty much the same in terms of size. But then once the iPhone came out and people had devices, small devices that were in portrait mode that they could hold in their hand, when they visited web pages, it was hard to use them because the web page would just automatically shrink down, and it was hard to use them. You had to zoom in, and still to this day, there are still some web pages that are out there that are older, or maybe they're built by old school dudes who never learned media queries and responsive design, and it's a pain in the butt to use those web pages. So that's the purpose of these media queries, essentially. Next, we'll talk about very briefly about JavaScript. So before I get into JavaScript, some pros might be like, what are you talking about? You're done talking about HTML and CSS. There's so many other aspects. Of course there are, but I really only wanted to touch on the absolute beginner fundamentals, which is what I just did. Of course, there's going to be more intermediate to advanced concepts, but I'm not going to bog down a beginner with all that stuff. What I just told you is probably going to get you by, in most people, very far as a conceptual level understanding goes. So JavaScript itself, it's a scripting language for implementing features like user interface interactivity, animations, 2D, 3D graphics, stuff like image carousels, and more. So when I mean UI interactivity, so in the context of the example that we're about to start coding, when you're using it on a smartphone, and you see the little hamburger icon menu that you see up there, the three lines that are stacked vertically on each other. When you touch that, you have a menu that's displayed somewhere on the user interface automatically. That's done with the help of JavaScript. So there's three different layers when it comes to building web pages as a front-end developer. And so first is HTML, next is CSS. You need to understand those things pretty much together. And then once you have a solid understanding of those two things, then you can start learning JavaScript. It can also be written in an HTML document with a style, with the script tag. Look at me screwing this up. Or inside an external JavaScript file. Now, also as an aside, modern front-end development frameworks like libraries, and libraries like React, Vue, and Angular, they are written with JavaScript. And I only decided to mention this because chances are, if you're itching to get into web development, maybe you've been researching it a little bit and you've heard of these things called like React or Vue or Angular, just understand that those are written on top of JavaScript, and you should not be touching those if you're a beginner. Alright, so like I mentioned before, if you're interested in front-end development, you first start with your HTML, your CSS. Then you get into understanding JavaScript itself. Sometimes that's referred to as a vanilla JavaScript, just plain old JavaScript. Then once you have a good, solid understanding of the basics and fundamentals as it pertains to JavaScript, then you can get into React, Vue, and Angular. I'm not going to be getting into too much JavaScript here, only because I'm going to be putting out a free course on an introduction to JavaScript very shortly. So that's why you need to subscribe up if you haven't yet, and click that bell notification icon. Alright, so now we're ready to rock, and that ends the boring slide portion. So now we're going to give some context to this theory that we've been going over. And things are going to start like making a lot more sense as we actually start doing. Alright, so let's get started. Alright, so the very first step that we need to start with is to first create a folder on our computer. So you could be on Mac, you could be on Linux, you could be on Windows, whatever, it doesn't matter. Hopefully you know how to create a folder. If you don't, you need probably not watch this course anymore and get some basic computer skills first. But I'm going to create the folder right now using the command line, and I'm just using a console emulator called Commander, and it's free, but whatever. And I'm just going to go into my code folder and then type in make-dir, mkdir, which is the command for creating a folder, and I'm going to call it front-ender. I don't know. That's just what I literally came up on the top of my head right now. We're also going to, after it's created, we're going to put double ampersands for and. Afterwards, after it's created, we're going to cd, or we're going to jump into that folder, and that's going to be front-ender. Alright, so now we're in there, and at this point I want you to, if you're brand new to this and you don't already have a code editor, go to Google, type Visual Studio Code, download it, install it, then you can relaunch your console if you're going to do it this way, and then open up your code editor, your Visual Studio Code, and that's going to type in code period inside of the current directory, and that will launch. It's launching on my different monitor over here. Let me get it over here. I have to update it apparently. It'll launch Visual Studio Code in this brand new empty folder right here, front-ender. Alright, so this is what the code editor looks like. A little scary if you're new to it, don't worry about that. Right here is new file. That's what we want to click. We're going to create one called index.html, and index right here is an important name because most web servers recognize this as being basically the starting page for a given folder. Alright, so index.html. Okay, so this is, once we create it, this is where we're going to start writing out our HTML. Alright, so first let me get rid of that, and you can also notice that there's something different that maybe you don't see. Mine, it shows my index.html with a number 3 by the side, but if I go to view and I go to my problems, we could see I have this validator extension that I've installed already. So if you don't see this, that's the reason. There's an extension that you can install for your validator for these things to show, and it's already given me issues saying certain things aren't in here that need to be in here in terms of the HTML document itself. So if you want access to install this plugin, you just click over here, the extensions, and you type in W3C, and then the one I have installed is right here. And you can see it doesn't have the install because I already have it installed. So just click install and go through the steps, and it's very easy to install it. And you'll have to reload your Visual Studio Code app, and it'll reload it for you, and you'll be ready to go with it. And so you want to go to View and then Problems to get this little indicator down here. Me, for the purpose of writing the code and having as much space as possible so you can see what I'm writing, I'm not going to show it. But again, it's a good thing if you're starting out to have that there. Alright, so what we're going to do now is just go back here to our document and let's get started. So I'm going to take a little bit of a shortcut here. And by the way, if you want to change the size and scale of your type and the UI itself, you can hit Control key plus the plus sign to make it bigger, or the minus sign to make it smaller. So for now, I'm just going to make it big so I want to make sure you can see everything. So if we can do a shortcut to get some of the boilerplate or the initial HTML written out of the way, because it's a little bit cumbersome and annoying to have to write out all these initial CSS or HTML tags every time you want to write HTML. So if I just hit the exclamation point and hit enter, we see that it's going to give us all this HTML. One side tip or side note, to save space on my screen, I can hit Control B to get rid of that sidebar, and then Control B to bring it back. So I will be doing that periodically. All right, so here we're going to see